Do you like rags to riches stories with intrigue, betrayal, murder, love, heartbreak? Well, then you should read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And one question before we get to the review: did I enjoy reading this story? And the answer is yes. Welcome to Whiskey and Literature, where we read and discuss the greatest books of all time. And while we're turning those pages, we're sipping those bottles of finely distilled spirits. I'm your host, Captain Mike, and I'm reading and reviewing 52 books in 52 weeks in 2023. This is my 24th book review of the year, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And before we get to the book, let's talk about the author, Charles Dickens. He was an English author, born in 1812, died in 1870. He is one of the best-known authors of all time and has created some of the most memorable characters: Scrooge, Tiny Tim, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and Pip. He pioneered the serial style type of writing or releasing of his books, often leaving his readers with cliffhangers so they would come back to purchase his magazine over and over again. And he even inspired a whole new industry where illiterate people would gather on street corners to pay a small sum to listen to someone read his stories to them. The general public loved him because he often spoke about the plight of the poor people and challenged their assumptions about poor people and criminals. As I was telling my wife about Charles Dickens and his life, she was a bit dismayed to hear that he had basically abandoned his wife for an 18-year-old actress when he was 45 years old. And as a mother herself, my wife didn't really like to hear how Charles Dickens thought, however deservedly, towards his own mother. And we do try and separate artists and authors' lives from their works, but sometimes it's noteworthy because there is some bleed over from their personal lives to their work. Though, however you look at him, Charles Dickens obviously is one of the greatest authors of all time. And one last thing before we get to the book, the Whiskey of the Week, just a brief mention. This review will drop later this week. If you're interested, we have Whistle Pig, 6-year-old, 100% rye, piggyback. Like I said, I do book and whiskey reviews, and the link to this will be in the description below. Okay, now let's get to the specs and the stats of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. This book was released between 1860 and 1861 in a serial format, then published in 3 volumes in 1861. And I've heard from multiple people how Charles Dickens was actually paid by the word or paid by the line. And I'm not necessarily sure that that is technically true, but because he released his books in his own magazine in this drawn out format, he was kind of incentivized to not shorten his books, because the longer the books were, the more copies of his magazine would sell. While I did read some of the book, I mostly listened to it on Audible, and it was read by Matt Lucas for 20 hours and 39 minutes. And Great Expectations has been categorized in many different genres: a crime novel, historical novel, a Bill Dunn's roman, comic, and a gothic novel. Okay, let's talk briefly about the style of the book. And definitely releasing this in serial format, it dictated the styling of Great Expectations. We have short chapters that are focused on a single character. It is fast-paced, moves along briskly despite the occasional repetitious dialogue and action. And I think those were driven by, again, the fact that it's released in a series. It's written in first person, moves in a linear format, moves along very quickly, and it is an easy, fun read. Some of the major themes in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations are ambition, love, redemption by love, moral character, social classes, and wealth. All right, let's talk about the plot. It's broken down into 3 parts or 3 stages. In the first stage, we meet Pip, an orphan of about 7 years old who lives with his much older sister and her husband, the blacksmith, Joe Gargery. One night, while wandering the nearby marshland, he runs across the escaped convict, Abel Magwitch, who basically intimidates and threatens him into fetching for him a file and some food. Pip begins going to the status house to visit Ms. Havisham, where she meets Estella and he is instantly smitten with her. The time that Pip spends at the Saddest house convinces him that he is coarse and uncultured, and he tells Biddy that he wants to become a gentleman. Pip is formally apprenticed to Joe Gargery to become a blacksmith, and he follows that trade until he receives communication from the lawyer Jaggers that he has great expectations from a benefactor who Pip assumes to be Miss Havisham, and that he is to move to London, become tutored, and become a gentleman. With Pip in London, we begin stage 2. Pip becomes friends with his roommate and tutor, Herbert, who is unsuccessfully trying to save capital so that he can prosper and marry his sweetheart. Pip receives an allowance from his benefactor and lives a lavish lifestyle that leaves both him and his roommate deep in debt. All the while that this is going on, Pip pursues Estella, who has been groomed since she was adopted by Ms. Havisham to break men's hearts. She tells continuously Pip that she's not who he thinks she is and that he is not listening to what she's saying. He negotiates his relationships with those from his hometown who now he feels are beneath him, and with those from London, like his lawyer Jaggers and associates and various others. And always Estella is right there in the background being pursued, but always out of the reach of Pip. And the third stage starts right after Pip learns that his benefactor is not in fact Miss Havisham, but instead the convict that he met on the marshland in the first chapter. And this is the catalyst that begins the rest and the ending of the story. And we could talk for days and days and days about this story and the intricacies of it, but that's basically a general overview of the plot. And all I'm going to say is it was a great story. Okay, characters. Let's go through some of the main characters in Great Expectations. And in deference for time, we're not going to go through them all, just enough to kind of flesh out a bit of the plot in the story. First and foremost, we have Philip Pirrip, nicknamed Pip, orphan, main character, and narrator of Great Expectations. Next, we have Joe Gargery, Pip's brother-in-law and father figure. He is a blacksmith, and he's the only one who is always kind to Pip, and the only one that Pip is always honest to. We have Mrs. Joe Gargery, Pip's sister, who's at least 20 years older than him. She raises him up by hand, sternly, and she is disabled in a botched burglary or attack and is left disabled through the second half of the story until she passes away. We have Mr. Pumblechook. He is Joe Gargery's uncle, and he actually is the one that connected Miss Havisham to Pip, and as such, he always claimed to be the architect of Pip's Great Expectations. Now we get to Miss Havisham, and she is worthy of a bit longer of a bio. She's a wealthy spinster who takes on Pip as a companion for herself and her adopted daughter, Estella. Miss Havisham is an eccentric woman who has worn the same dress and only one shoe since the day she was left at the altar. Her house is unchanged as well. She hates all men and plots revenge by teaching Estella to torment and spurn all of them, including Pip. Of course, at the end of the story, she's overcome by remorse and is sorry for having ruined Pip's and Estella's chance for happiness. After confessing her plot to Pip, her house catches fire, her dress catches fire, and she is burned really badly and dies. Then we get to Estella. This is Miss Havisham's adopted daughter, and she is a beautiful young woman, and she just grows more beautiful as she gets older. And to Pip, Estella, she represents the life of wealth and culture. And Miss Havisham, through her teaching, has basically made Estella unable to return Pip's feelings and passion. She tells Pip this many times, but he is unable or unwilling to listen or hear her. And towards the end of the story, Estella marries an abusive man, Drummel. Then we get to Herbert Pocket. He is Pip's roommate and tutor, and they first meet when they're both kids at Miss Havisham's house, and Herbert challenges Pip to a fist fight. And later when he becomes Pip's tutor and roommate, they become the best of friends. And then we get to the convict. He escaped from a prison ship nearby, and Pip runs across him in the marshland and treats him kindly, and he becomes Pip's benefactor. And all the while that Pip was in London and kind of growing up, and before he became of age, I think 23 years old, the convict Abel Magwitch sent him an allowance anonymously through the attorney, the lawyer Jaggers. When he came of age, Pip, the convict, came to London from Australia, which is where they sent convicts. They were like, okay, you can either go to prison forever or we can send you to Australia, but you can't return home. But he did return home to reveal himself to Pip. Going back to Pip's village when he was a kid, we meet a girl named Biddy. She is a girl near Pip's age, and she teaches in a school at her grandmother's house. She's a kind and intelligent and poor young woman. Also, like Pip and Estella, she's an orphan. And unfortunately for Pip, he basically ignores her as he is pursuing Estella. Towards the end of the story, Pip is very, very ill. He's cared for by Joe Gargery, who then leaves right as Pip is getting well again. Pip reflects on his life and his situation and realizes he could have and should have been with Biddy, returns home to his hometown to ask Biddy to marry him on the same day that Biddy marries Joe Gargery. Then back in London, we get to Mr. Jaggers. He is Pip's lawyer, and he represents the interest of Pip's benefactor, the convict, and Miss Havisham as well. That's where we meet him initially. By the end of the story, it seems like everyone in the whole story knows Jaggers and is associated with him. Then we meet John Wemmick, who was a fantastic character. He is a clerk for Mr. Jaggers. He was a go-between for Mr. Jaggers and Pip. And by the end of the story, he's actually taking care of or advising directly Pip. He lives with his father, the aged parent, in a mock-up of a castle in some London neighborhood, and even has a moat and drawbridge. Those are some of the main characters. There is so many characters in this book. Compeyson, Orlick, Drummel, Molly, just to name a few. There's just too many to go through. Okay, so my thoughts on Great Expectations. It is impossible to read David Copperfield in January and Great Expectations in May and not compare the two novels. And I do recognize that each book should stand on its own merits. Both David Copperfield and Great Expectations are very clearly written by the same author, the same time period, the same setting, the same over-the-top characters, and the same occasional over-detailed scene setting. That makes sense. One of the biggest differences in the books is the main characters, David Copperfield and Pip. And I stand by my statement in my review for David Copperfield that he is the friend that we all deserve and the kind of friend that we all hope we can be to our friends. However, Pip, I don't really want Pip to be my friend. And if you'd like to see my review for David Copperfield, link is in the description below, along with all the other book reviews that I've done this year so far. If David Copperfield is a shiny bauble, all pretty and bright, Great Expectations is a tarnished coin, much handled and worn, but for all that, still valuable. I really enjoyed reading David Copperfield, even more than I enjoyed reading Great Expectations. But I do recognize that Great Expectations is the superior book. It is a more complex story with great iconic characters. The scenery is better. From the marshes, the forge, Saddis House, Walworth, and the attempting to flee across the Thames, it's just beautiful. The characters are well written with complex interwoven relationships. This is Dickens' penultimate novel, and it shows. He pulls out all the stops. Even the ending is ambiguous, and it's uncertain whether at the end and he changed it at least once as far as I can tell, and it's really uncertain, can be interpreted either way, whether Estella and Pip actually end up together. And when I read it, when I finished the book, not actually having realized that he had changed the ending and that there is some ambiguity in there, I assumed when I finished reading the story that Estella and Pip are not together. And I think that's okay. Sometimes the stories that feel the truest don't have the happiest endings because it's a good ending and it felt right for this story. Great Expectations is a fantastic read, and if you haven't turned these pages, you should. All right, guys, on to the star rating. I'm gonna look down here, see what I put down for the star rating for Great Expectations, and I rate my books on 5 criteria. 6 if I listen to it on Audible, and I did listen to Great Expectations on Audible, so this will get 6 comments on it. So first, initial response. How did I feel when I first finished the book? I'm going to give it a 4. I felt pretty good. It's not the happiest of books, but I enjoyed the read. Okay, recommendation. How likely am I to recommend this book? 4. I think everyone should read Great Expectations. 3. Did I enjoy the writing style? And I only gave it a 3 on the style. 4, plot and structure. How engaged was I in the story? And I'm going to give it a 5 because I really enjoyed turning these pages. I thought the plot was complex and interwoven and awesome and pretty well done. Characters. Dude, you can't read Great Expectations and not give it a 5 for the characters. I mean, Pip, the convict, Joe Gargery, Miss Havisham. I mean, great characters. Audible. And, sometimes I do feel bad. I feel like Charles Dickens is so far removed from Audible, but listening to this on Audible was part of my experience. So I do rate these books that I listen to for the production that they have on Audible. And I'm only going to give it a 3 because Matt Lucas, I think, did just an okay job. Okay, so if you add all that up, that's 24. And 24 divided by 6 is 4. So that's 4 stars for Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I think that's an appropriate number for this book. Okay, that's it. Thanks for sticking with me. In the description below are the links to my other reviews. If you enjoyed the video, like it, it's free. Subscribe to see more of my content. I hope you are reading something good and drinking something great. Turn the pages, my friends, and stay thirsty. Cheers.